It's a rite of passage for any new French president, that first major tour of Africa. The one kicked off in Burkina Faso by 39-year-old Emmanuel Macron, including the usual trimmings, a nod to multi-party democracy, an official visit to a nation that in 2014 overthrew a longtime strongman, and the big speech, the one that perennially promises an end to what the French call la Françafrique, that uniquely symbiotic relationship between Paris and its former colonies. Macron, in his speech at the University of Ouagadougou, reminding his audience that, like them, he was born after independence, that a continent, he insists, is nothing less than a crossroads for all the challenges we face as a planet. Words spoken on the eve of an unprecedented EU-Africa summit that he will be attending in neighboring Ivory Coast. Those challenges, the demographic explosion of Africa, migration, terrorism, development, climate change, well, they're all on the menu in Abidjan Wednesday. Now, outside the university, protests by students against the old way of doing business, and in particular against the region's common currency, the CFA franc, a currency pegged to the euro, whose bills and coins are still printed here in France. But more broadly, how do France and Europe rethink their relationship with Africa? How do nations like Burkina Faso, who rely on the permanent presence of French troops in the fight against jihadist insurgents, how do those nations handle their relations with the former colonial masters? Today in the France 24 debate, we're looking at Macron and Africa. With us, Ali Traoré, member of the citizens group Ballet Citoyen, which translates as the broom, right? The broom, because in 2014 it was civil society that effectively forced out the country's strongman. Thank you for being with us.
Absolutely, thank you.
Also joining us, Julia Wano, Executive Director at Internet Without Borders. Welcome back to the show. Louis Béduchat, Senior Advisor at Price Waterhouse-Coopers. How are you?
Fine, thank you.
And from Ottawa, Canada, Kiari Liman Tingiri, Niger-born founder of the International Development Consultancy, IEADS. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. Welcome to having me.
The France 24 debate on Facebook and Twitter, the hashtag F24debate. France doesn't have an Africa policy as such. The words of Emmanuel Macron in that speech at Ouagadougou University. Emerald Maxwell has more.
It's a delicate balancing act for the French president. Boost France's profile in Burkina Faso without reverting to the colonial dynamics of the past. During a lively question and answer session with students at the University of Ouagadougou, Emmanuel Macron marked a generational change in his country's relationship with Africa.
I haven't come here to tell you about France's policies for Africa. I'm from a generation that doesn't tell Africa what to do.
Macron's trip got off to a hostile start. When hours before he arrived, a grenade was thrown at French troops, wounding 3 civilians. French special forces have been in the country since 2010 to help tackle jihadist violence in the region. That topic will be on the agenda when Macron heads to Ivory Coast next to attend the Europe-Africa summit. Clandestine migration will also be addressed, with Macron proposing a crackdown on the networks of human smugglers between Africa and Europe. It comes amid growing outrage over politicians' failure to clamp down on human trafficking and slave auctions in Libya.
I will propose also that Africa and Europe come to the aid of the people trapped in Libya and help with a massive evacuation of those in danger. It's our duty.
On his Burkina Faso stop, Macron also promised to declassify secret French files on the country's assassinated leader, Thomas Sankara. Hailed as a revolutionary hero in many parts of the continent, many Burkinabe believe France had a role in his downfall.
We'll have more on what Thomas Sankara was assassinated 30 years ago, what that means for the country. But first, Ali Traoré, it was an hour and 45-minute speech, then there was an hour of question-answer. How did France's president do? How did he do in that speech?
We are happy to welcome Mr. Macron in Burkina Faso because it is a really hazardous travel in Burkina Faso. Why? Because the youngness of Burkina Faso is one of the most conscious politically conscious, and we show it in 2014.
Yeah, because usually a first trip by a French president to Africa, it's to Senegal, sometimes to Ivory Coast, but this time to Burkina Faso.
I think Macron will want to be original from the other presidents. It's the reason why he says that French has never, won't have ever an African policy. After hearing his speech, I'm not agree with that because he talked about us. It is a friendship he want to build with us, a new friendship, but he hadn't respect the conditions he mentioned in his speech. He talked about the finish of this French policy, of African policy of France. But he talked about is a strategy, French strategy in Africa, according to entrepreneurship. He talked about education. He talked about his meeting in Abidjan. I think all these things are components of this African policy. So, Mr. Macron...
So there still is a grand plan for Africa.
A big plan for Africa, a big plan which won't never see, which won't change anything.
Louis Bédouchat, you agree that, because we've heard previous French presidents say it's the end of the Françafrique, that symbiotic relation. And that
I think obviously there are links, historical links between France and Africa. We cannot deny this. I think for President Macron, the first thing was to avoid a catastrophe and a speech which could have been misinterpreted. Remember that Sarkozy made a catastrophe, yeah? And I think that you remember that.
There was a speech in Dakar where he talked about Africans had not entered history
I
yet.
suppose Macron wanted to avoid a catastrophe like this. I think the result is okay, no catastrophe, but I would say no revolution as well for the moment. You know, he came to Burkina Faso, he said good things, everybody can agree with this, but this is probably not sufficient.
Yeah, he put it right out there. At the beginning, he quotes Thomas Sankara, who was this non-commissioned officer who staged this, what they called the revolution in the 1980s. All of Africa knows about it, and was assassinated in 1987 by one of his comrades in arms. And there's always been the suspicion that somehow France might be involved. And he said in his speech, Macron, he's going to make the files public.
Yes, well, he did announce that he would make the files on Thomas Sankara's assassination public, and which is a very good step. But at the same time, his speech and all his discourse on Africa is made of. He's always trying to be very centric, but he ends up saying very contradictory things. First thing that I would like to mention is that his visit to Burkina Faso, to Ouagadougou, is really the mirror of the disconnection between African and French elites and the civil society, and youth in particular. And there are various symbols of that. One symbol is that, on the one hand, the Burkinabese authority closed school for 2 days to welcome President Macron, when at the same time, young people were in the street renaming the Avenue Général de Gaulle, renaming it the Avenue Thomas Sankara.
Yeah, just to remind viewers that we're in 2017, but there still is an Avenue Général de Gaulle.
Absolutely. So the name of the General who freed France from the Nazis, but also who had a very questionable in the decolonization of Africa. So his speech is also...
He did make the push for independence when he was president.
He did, but there are various things to say about this. But yes, nevertheless, a very interesting speech in terms of contradictions. Because on the one hand, indeed, he talks about ending Françafrique, not doing like his predecessors, going to talk to the youth, talking about entrepreneurship and all these very, very interesting issues. But at the same time, no major announce, for instance, on the franc CFA, on the currency, which is being used by 16 Western and Central African countries and the Comores. Nothing, I mean, very little has been said, no words in his speech. It's only during the question and answer session that at last somebody mentioned the franc CFA, and he had to answer. And even in his answer, from the beginning of his speech, he was pretending that he was not here in Ouagadougou to give any lessons to anybody. But answering on the franc CFA specifically, and on other subjects such as demography, etc., he's been quite condescending to some extent.
A little bit patronizing, you're saying. We'll get back to the issue of that common currency a little bit later on. First, though, before I turn to Chiara Limantingiri, just to give an idea of what Julie was talking about, the highlight of the speech was the question-answer session. It got sometimes a little bit feisty, like when a young student pointed to Macron's attendance Wednesday to West Africa's largest solar-powered electric plant outside Ouagadougou for its inauguration. She asked, when's the air conditioning at the university going to be fixed?
You speak to me as if France was still a colonial power, but I do not want to take care of electricity problems in the universities of Burkina Faso. That's his job. That's the job of the president. So on the other hand, I reassure you. Oh, what's this? He's going away. Stay there. Maybe he's off to repair the air conditioning.
All right, Chiara Limantingiri, the tone in that exchange, it was tongue-in-cheek by Emmanuel Macron. Did he cross a line?
First, I think for at least one thing, the speech and the question to me were very helpful and very good, because on the issue of CFA, franc CFA, President Macron has been clear and sharp. There is no more political reason to try to sustain the CFA. And I think everybody would agree that it has been a failure and that the time has come to move on. Why should we get rid of CFA? At least three basic reasons. It has never served really economic growth. It has never served trade between the countries. When you take West Africa, these are the poorest countries in the world. So we cannot claim that the common currency has been something very helpful. And lastly, all the monetary policies in the region have been hindering. They really hindered development. You know, in this region, we have now a double-digit interest rate, while the global interest rate is around 3%. You just cannot have any profitable investment in such a context.
Yeah, but Chiara, a lot of the countries that don't have this common currency in Africa, they also have high interest rates, and they also have currencies that have at times been devalued in a disastrous fashion. Look at Ghana in the past, Nigeria. It's not, and look at currently the state of the rand in South Africa. So whether or not you have the CFA, is that really an indicator of how you're doing?
Yeah, the claim is not wrong that other African countries do have high interest rates, but they don't have the stability, the so-called stability CFA is providing. My claim is that CFA countries have never used the long time of stability they had to have a genuine, a well-functioning financial sector. That's why they can have that high interest rate. There are other reasons, but let's move on. We have to get rid of CFA, but how? My claim is that the best way to move out of CFA is to go to dollarization.
To go to the dollarization of the common currency. Chiara,
absolutely, absolutely. Because number one, there is no enough trade between the countries to claim that these countries would be a kind of optimal currency area. You can get rid of CFA, but if you maintain the same situation, it will not work. The elephant in the room is Nigeria. The elephant in the room is Nigeria. Would we go? And President Macron said it very clearly, and I agree with him, that the critical issue is the boundaries of a common currency in West Africa. What would be the boundaries? Who would be in and who would be out? Would we go with Nigeria, which would be a new sort of Naira zone? And we know that the currency management of Nigeria is not something we would like to share. It has never been something successful. Nobody believes that the Central Bank of Nigeria can be or has never been independent. So we have, my point is, and Nigeria itself is quite reluctant to go as fast as the other countries would like.
As fast as the other countries you're mentioning. Let me bring in, just very quickly before we go to the break, Louis Bedoucha. You hear there Chiari mentioning the problem is, and Macron didn't really address it. In fact, he didn't talk about the common currency. People thought he would during the linear portion of his speech.
He said things about the CFA.
But only the question-answer portion.
At least he said, listen, I will do what the African states would like to do, which is a new point. If African states would like globally to leave CFA and create a new currency, which you can call African unit as you like, I think Macron has no problem with this, The problem is that you need to know, and this is for my colleague from Canada, is that there is no consensus between African states about creating a new currency or leaving the CFA. It's not obvious that it's a real advantage. Look at Mauritania, look at Guinea, and look at Nigeria. Life is not simple when you have to manage your own currency and you are not a big country. South Africa is different. It's a large country. Look at small countries with like Mauritania or Guinea. It's not always an easy life.
All right, when we come back, because we have to take a quick break, we're going to pick up on these points and also look at what is Macron's vision for Africa. Stay with us. You're watching the France 24 debate.
Exclusive.
French President Emmanuel Macron appears exclusively on France 24 and RFI. He'll be talking about people smuggling in Libya, the migrant crisis, his commitment to fighting terrorism in the Sahel, and his vision for Africa, its development and ties with the European Union. Don't miss this exclusive interview on France 24 and France24.com.
There are those of us who like to venture to the unexplored. Those of us who go out there with a sense of wonder, bridging worlds, finding delight in our differences. If you are one of us and you want to explore more of this great planet, we're ready to take you there. Widen your world. Turkish Airlines.
Welcome back. Before we resume the France 24 debate, some of the stories we're following for you in the newsroom. Kenya's president sworn in after a rerun election boycotted by the opposition. Police break up memorial rallies for those killed in protests. Another 3 fatalities. In Burma, Pope Francis calls for justice and respect for human rights. However, he refrains from any mention of the Rohingya or the UN's accusation of ethnic cleansing. And French bank Société Générale to cut a further 900 jobs and close 300 high street branches by 2020, all part of SocGen's push to encourage online banking. Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. It's the France 24 debate. France's new president making his first major tour of the African continent, visiting former colony Burkina Faso, where he gave a big speech, and it's ahead of an unprecedented Africa-EU summit that's taking place Wednesday in Ivory Coast's capital, Abidjan. We're speaking about it in the company of Ali Traoré, a member of the citizens group Ballet Citoyen, the Broom, I guess you could call it, Citizens Broom, is how, I guess how you would translate that. Well, helped topple a longtime strongman in Burkina Faso back in 2014. Welcome back as well, Julia Wono, Executive Director of Internet Without Borders, Louis Bédouchat, Senior Advisor at PricewaterhouseCoopers, and from Ottawa, Chiari Liman-Tingari, who is the founder of the international development consultancy IEADS. We were talking before the break about how, well, there were a couple of moments where the crowd pushed back a little during Emmanuel Macron's long speech at Ouagadougou University, like when he talked of limiting the number of births. He was speaking in a country where population growth outpaces growth, he said, and when he said France would put the accent on girls when increasing the number of university scholarships.
I will be on the sides of all heads of states and African governments who will make the choice of the compulsory education for young girls. I will defend their choice, and I will ask the French Development Agency to support, as a priority, the programs that aim to educate young girls. I will set our embassies the objective of signing scholarships in France as a priority to young girls.
And there's a little bit of wavering in the audience at that point, Ali Traoré. And then he said, don't worry, we'll also give scholarships to boys too, but priority goes to girls. What were your thoughts when you heard that part of the speech?
I find this message definitely condescending. It is one of the characteristics of Emmanuel Macron, and he shows it in Ouagadougou like he make it always. He always make it. And one thing I want to say is that we have to stop to opposite the gender. A little boy, a little girl, they need at the same level of priority to go to school. It is a priority of Africans' youngness, because this youngness need education. And the symbol of University of Ouagadougou was a good symbol. But this message is not the right one, I think. But I'm not surprised. It is not a surprise. I was ready to these kinds of reflection, because Emmanuel Macron is thinking like someone who is not in the African realities, and I don't think it is to Macron to say us what we have to do.
But that African reality is that girls drop out of school younger than boys, and wherever they do, the development indicators are poor.
It is not only young girls, young boys too. When you look at the consequences of bad governance of our leaders with the complicity of France, with the complicity of with a lack of transparency in all the markets French companies got in Africa. That's the problem.
That's a different topic.
I think
we'll talk about that.
That's the problem.
We'll talk about corruption, but we're one issue at a time. Let's talk about education here.
It is the consequences of these kind of actions which make our education at a bad level, and the little girls that we're talking about are facing the consequences of this bad governance.
Julia Wono, for or against what Emmanuel Macron said, which is I'm going to put the accent on scholarships for girls?
Well, it's a very interesting news, and it's part of one of the very interesting things Mr. President Macron said during his speech. Indeed, there is a gap. We have to be honest. There is a gap in education between women, girls, and boys in many countries on the African continent, and sub-Saharan Africa in particular. This said, it's a bit disturbing that the development debate, the economic development debate, is now being focused on the demographic issue, and specifically, very specifically on birth control of African women, especially my question is whether it is legitimate for a French president to come and lecture African women on their birth control. It's indeed a
He didn't lecture African women. He said, why is it that, these girls, and he said girls, because in some cases they start having
he did mention
children as teenagers.
Women, young girls being married, and that's a reality, but that's not the only reality.
And he said sometimes against their will.
That's not the only reality on the one hand. And on the second hand, there are plenty of organizations already, feminist organization, women's organization, doing a lot of work trying to highlight the issue of birth control. But the issue here is what is causing the demographic, the development issue on the African continent. Is it only demography? I don't think so. There are very, very real issues, including corruption, good governance, lack of transparency on the issue of the currency, illicit financial outflows by foreign multinationals.
Sure.
So there are
a lot of
many issues.
Chiari Di Mantiguri, in a previous life, you worked at UNICEF. Your thoughts, how should a French president broach this topic of a demography that is skyrocketing on the African continent? What words should he employ?
I mean, I'm not a political actor, but definitely I think in most of West African countries, demographic growth is an issue. We might not want to look at it, but it's a reality. You cannot sustain per capita income growth if you have 4% of demographic growth. Nobody has never did it. No country in human history has never developed with such a high demographic growth. So, would the president say it? Did he say it the right way? I'm not really competent to say if that is patronage or how, but that's a real issue. And the strategy to tackle it through girls' education is also a good one. The United Nations have been advocating for it for 20 years. So it's not something new or something coming from France or from Macron. I mean, that's everybody who has been in development knows that externalities to girl education is one of the highest strategical action you can take in an underdeveloped country. These are my take. Now, really the political game around it, I don't think it's quite important. What is important?
It is very important.
That's an issue.
Especially for African feminist women.
And that's academically established effective strategy. Now, of course, it might have been said somewhere else or in other words. I leave that to the political actors.
Louis Bédéchat, your thoughts?
No, I agree with my colleague from Canada. Everybody in development business knows that the women literacy rate, the birth rate is an issue for development. We all know that. The question raised by my two African colleagues is it the role of the French president to say that? I cannot say it's, I'm not sure it is. That's all. They know that in Africa. So do we need to insist? Is it the role of the French president to come in Africa and to say this? I'm not sure.
And not talk about the other very important issues, and specifically, I was mentioning the illicit financial outflows, especially by big international firms, which harness a lot of materials on the African continent and do not pay the necessary taxes to help fund necessary infrastructures, necessary education programs, necessary development programs to help uplift.
All right, there was a nod to that, however, in his speech. Although there were no concrete proposals, but there was a nod to it, which was when we heard the French president try to encourage French small and medium-sized businesses to get more involved in Africa. That's something that we know about. We chronicled the big multinational corporations, and you were alluding to accusations of sometimes collusion with corrupt leaders. But the small, medium-sized businesses, well, that's important for the fiber of both France and the countries that he's visiting.
It is absolutely important. And he also mentioned entrepreneurship. entrepreneurship by African youth and entrepreneurship by French citizens. He also encouraged a lot of French citizens to come to work in multinationals on the African continent, and specifically mentioning those who will speak an African language. That's very encouraging. This said, once as you mentioned, there was no concrete commitment on the issue of how to make these big multinationals behave the same way they behave on their national markets, for instance, and behave the same way in sub-Saharan African markets. We heard about the president announcing an increase in the public development aid, and that's very good, an increase from 0.35% of the national revenue to 0.55 as it is advised by the OECD and other international organizations. That is very good. But at the same time, international public aid is worth, I think, 8 billion euros. It was worth in France. France spent an amount of 8 billion euros in international development aid, when we know that each year illicit financial outflows cost 40 billion in tax revenues to African countries. So it's 5 times.
But is that the fault of the French, or is that the fault of the Africans who don't collect their taxes?
Not at all. But the issue of illicit financial outflows is negative, and is detrimental to African nations, but also to the French nation and Western nations as well, because we all know that these companies are using paradise. With the Panama Papers, we know that they don't put their money back into the Western's tax revenues. So the issue is to say here that fighting to raise the economic, to help Africa develop, we need also to talk about taxes. We need also to make sure that these Western companies are behaving the same way on the French and European markets, the same way that they would and they should on African markets, and specifically in the countries that President Macron is going to visit in the next few days.
Several times during that question answer, Ali Traoré, he said, "Hey, I'm not the boss of Burkina Faso. Don't if you have good governance issues in your own country, address them with your own president."
I'd like to say something about this question of strategy of Macron with entrepreneurship, with little business to come in Africa. It's definitely, when you say that French companies need to make business in Africa, I agree with this. This is a good point. But where I'm not agree is when Macron is talking about the help of development. Africans don't need any help. You have to be confident in us. We are able to make it. When Thomas Sankara were in Burkina Faso, like president, I was president, we hadn't any help, but we succeed. It is the question. The question is here: Africans no more need to beg help everywhere. We have to be able to change our life by ourselves. Stop financing our governance, because our leaders are using this money to be wealthy and to let our populations in difficulties. That's my points. And at the other point, I'm saying to the youngness of Africa, don't count on this help. This help is dangerous for us. It's really a bad thing for Africa.
That brings us to the topic of this. Chiari Limantingiri, that brings us to the subject of this summit that's taking place in Abidjan and opens on Wednesday. Unprecedented to have all these EU leaders that are going to be coming to Ivory Coast's capital. And you heard Ali Traoré there saying that there shouldn't be some kind of paternalistic calls for aid that may or may not be diverted.
I would rather build on what the former colleague says about tax evasion and leakages and governance. My feeling is that what maybe was missing in the speech and in the debate is state building. The reality on the ground is that it's a bit dangerous to bypass government. It's a bit dangerous to go directly, because nowhere and never countries have been able to develop without strong government bureaucracy. You need a functioning government. You need a functioning state. state building, building capacity within tax administration, for instance, is something important. It's something important. So yes, governance matters, governance capacity matters. We cannot just bypass government because small is beautiful, because local actors are powerful, or because entrepreneurs, even entrepreneurs need a functioning state. They need a well-regulated rule of the game. So my feeling is that what is really missing now is something to address the fragility of the state we have. Even if the government they just don't have the means to do it. Look at the territorial presence of our governments. They are just not around. So I mean, the point I want to do, whether Europe should say or not to governments, that's about, I mean, political decision. Those who are in charge, they have been elected, and they have to decide with whom they want to talk, when, and how. So I don't think it's a technical or debatable question. Nobody questioned the legitimacy of President Roch Kabore. So if he decided to attend a meeting on EU, then I think he's entitled to do so. He has been elected. He has a mandate from the people. He has the will of the people to do so.
Let me turn to you, Louis Bedoucha. What can we expect from this summit? And does Emmanuel Macron get Africa?
If I may just say a word about the financing. I'm sorry to say Africa needs money. Africa needs investment, and Africa needs foreign direct investment, because this is a fuel for development. Wherever it comes, you know, it can come from multilateral, it can come from Chinese, from French, for who you want in the earth, but they need money. We say, I used to work for the World Bank, we needed 90 billion a year to reach a certain level of infrastructure. And this would be difficult without any foreign direct investment. For the EU-Africa summit, what can we expect? Listen, probably a recognition of the need to invest probably more than it is done today on a global basis.
Invest how? Invest in what? Infrastructure, big public works projects?
We all know around this
small
table,
businesses, as Julie was mentioning.
We all know about this around this table that Africa needs power, Africa needs infrastructure, and something which has not been quoted by Emmanuel Macron, which doesn't cost a nickel, which is governance, you know. And this is something President Macron should have insisted on. Governance is the first fuel of the money. You cannot attract money without a good governance. And a good governance, it could be in Burkina, it could be Côte d'Ivoire. Yeah. Countries without governance cannot attract money.
He did mention indirectly governance by saying that he's not coming here to lecture presidents on democracy, on constitution, on rule of law.
It's
that's very
It's a tricky one, isn't it, for Emmanuel Macron? Because right now the Germans have these coalition talks going on. He is sort of, for now, the interim leader of Europe, with Angela Merkel busy trying to build a coalition. So as the former colonial power, heading into this summit in Abidjan, it's going to be tricky the way you've both mentioned how his tone seemed sometimes a little bit patronizing during that speech. What tone he has in Abidjan, in the middle of all those European leaders.
You know very well that Macron is smart. President Macron is smart. He should probably has worked on the subject with his team, you know, the Conseil Présidentiel for Africa. I think he can expect a lot of results. He will be very careful. We hope, what I hope personally, that he goes a bit forward, that this catalog, you know, of announcement he did. We need something more flesh, you know. This is not sufficient for the moment. But let's be optimistic. It's the first step of his trip, you know. There is Côte d'Ivoire and there is Ghana after that. So let's wait, maybe.
Yeah, he's concluding his trip in Ghana. Ali Traoré, your final question, your expectations of this summit that's taking place in Abidjan?
My expectations are two things. I think European companies in Africa needs to pay the taxes in Africa correctly and transparently.
You're hoping the summit will address that?
That's one point. And the second point is you have to buy all the African raw materials at the right price. Africans need to fix their price. This is our problem. When I'm talking about the fact that Africa don't need any help, we don't need help. We need just to be paid for what we sell to over the world.
All right, that will be the final word for now. Ali Traoré, I want to thank you. I want to thank Julia Wono, Louis Bédouchat, and Chiara Liman-Tingari for being with us from the Canadian capital, Ottawa. Stay with us, though. Media Watch is next. And we say hello to Haxi Myers-Belkin.
Hello, François. Oh.
Who also paying attention to Emmanuel Macron's speech. There were a few technical glitches during the speech. At times the sound cut out a little bit, but he soldiered on.
He did, and that's despite a little stunt that he was met with. You can see it here. I haven't actually got it on my computer. Slight technical hitches on our side. But Macron had to contend with the Avenue Charles de Gaulle in Ouagadougou being renamed by student activists, as you can see there, as Avenue Thomas Sankara. Something of a dig there, as you might imagine, François. And I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there because of a technical issue on our side.
What's the technical issue? Oh, dear. Computers.
It happens sometimes.
There you go. It happens sometimes. The issue of Thomas Sankara, it's coming up 30 years later. There was the president who said that he's willing to, but it's not up to him, it's up to the French courts to extradite the brother of the former leader, Blaise Compaoré, who's accused of murdering Sankara, and he's ready to declassify all the documents that France has in its possession. Did he say the right things on that one, Ali?
He said the right thing, but we're waiting for the action. And two things. We are waiting the brother of Blaise Compaoré in Ouagadougou. And the second thing is that when he's talking about making public the classified files, about what files is he talking about? Because when you talk about classified files, you have 3 levels. And the level 2 and 3 files has never been public in the history. This is the most important files, and it is these files that we want to see, that our judge needs to be able to clarify, to make justice in Burkina Faso for Thomas Sankara.
Yeah, because there was 1986. There's this a different French leader who came to Ouagadougou. It was François Mitterrand. There's a state dinner. Sankara gets up and lectures the French president. And then a year later, he's assassinated. So there's been a lot of speculation and wondering, did France have a hand in it? Louis Bédouchat, your trips to Africa, the name of Thomas Sankara, when it comes up, there's always a reaction.
It's a kind of a black energy. I mean, it's a kind of people. When you say this name, it's a kind of like Moïse Tshombe, of this African leaders who finished in a bad way. And there is truth. Truth must come one day. I think I agree with my friend from Africa, my 2 friends, I suppose. We need to know the truth, that's all. That's all they want in reality. And this is something I think legitimate.
And I think that will be the best way to build the new friendship that President Macron has called for during his speech. You cannot build friendship on lies or on dishonesty, and I think it's also part of the honesty work that has to be done.
And for viewers who don't know Africa, what is it about Sankara that captures the imagination still to this day? He was assassinated in 1987.
Yes, he's one of the least and probably the only French-speaking African leader who stood up to the former colonial power at a time when it was very dangerous to do so. In the French-African history, it has been so rare to have such a persona, a figure who could stand up to the former colonial power at a time indeed when it was dangerous to do so, and also he has been he has been a politician, really. He's really one of these rare people on the continent who's done politics, whose time at the head of as a head of state has made significant change in the lives of the people who were working with him at the time. So and on the lives of citizens. So I think that there has been no, I think, equivalent in very recent history on the African continent compared to English-speaking countries that we have so many names like Jomo Kenyatta or Amilcar Cabral, or in Portuguese-speaking Africa, or even, sorry, I can forget, what's the name of the Ghanaian? Nkrumah, thank you, Kwame Nkrumah. So it was quite the equivalent of all these figures, but in the French-speaking Africa, and he was kind of stopped in his ascension. So it was, I think that's why he's symbolic.
All right, the legacy of Sankara still being talked about in 2017. I want to thank our panel once again. Thank you, Hakti Myers-Belkin. Better luck with the technical issues.
Well, next time we hope
All right,
so.
and we want to thank you for joining us here in the France 24 debate.